The island is a rock in the Aegean, roughly 6 miles across, without a spring of fresh water that anyone has yet found, and the men who have been sent here under the Emperor's order arrive on it expecting to die of thirst before winter. One of them, a philosopher already past 50, walks the shore not to search for water, but to observe the strata of the stone, and within a few days he has located a seep that will sustain the small community of exiles who now depend upon him. When word of this discovery reaches Rome, it is not received as relief, but as an irritation, for the Emperor Nero had sent Musonius Rufus to Gyaros precisely so that the island itself would do the work of execution. Now the Emperor must consider whether to send men and finish the matter, or to let the philosopher live on the rock he has refused to be killed by. This is the situation we begin with. A man on an island that was meant to be his grave, and who, instead of grieving, has begun to teach. Other exiles find their way to him. Visitors from the mainland, at some risk to themselves, sail out to hear him speak, and what he speaks about, again and again, in fragments that survive to us through his student Lucius and through the later record of Stobaeus, is a single stubborn claim. That exile has taken from him nothing that belonged to him, that the Emperor, in sending him to this rock, has only moved his body from one place to another, and that his nature, his reason, his capacity to live well, remain wholly intact. Let us reflect on what this claim actually says, because it is easily misheard as bravado. The principle Musonius returns to, and which we will follow throughout this hour, is stated most plainly in the 9th of his surviving Discourses, the one titled, in the manuscripts, that exile is not an evil. The claim is not that exile is pleasant. The claim is not that suffering is unreal. The claim is that exile cannot deprive us of the things which constitute our nature as human beings, and that whoever grieves exile as a loss has misunderstood what he possessed to begin with. Here is Musonius, in the surviving Greek, rendered in the older English translation that we may quote freely. Exile does not deprive us of water, earth, air, or the sun, nor of the other planets, nor indeed of the society of men, for everywhere and in every way there is opportunity for association with them. If then it deprives us of none of these things, and if we need nothing else than these to live rightly and according to nature, how can exile be considered an evil? Consider the shape of that sentence. He does not begin by asserting his courage. He begins by taking inventory. What is present? What remains? Water is present, though on Gyaros he had to find it. Earth is present. Air, the sun, other men. And then the crucial move, which is a philosophical move, not a rhetorical one. He asks what a human being needs in order to live according to nature, and he finds that the list is short, and that exile has not touched any item on the list. The wise man knows, Musonius says elsewhere, that a human being is not made human by the walls of his native city, nor by the tomb of his ancestors, nor by the familiar streets. A human being is made human by his reason and by the exercise of virtue, and these travel with him wherever his body is sent. One must consider how strange this claim is, and how the strangeness of it is precisely what gives it force. Because on the face of it, exile is one of the oldest recognized punishments in the ancient world, and Rome, in the 1st century, used it deliberately, with graded severity, as an instrument of political discipline. To be relegated, to be deported, to be banished to a rocky island with insufficient water. These were not minor sentences. Cicero, who had endured exile only briefly and only to Thessalonica, wrote of it as a living death, a suspension of all that made life meaningful. Ovid, from his exile on the Black Sea, produced volumes of the most exquisite grief in Latin literature, the Tristia and the Epistulae ex Ponto, weeping in verse for the city he would never see again. Against this tradition, this deep Roman conviction that a man cut off from Rome had been cut off from life itself, Musonius stands on Gyaros and says calmly that the punishment has not touched him. It is thus a claim we must examine slowly. Before we can examine it, we must know the man and know why he came to be on the island in the first place. Gaius Musonius Rufus was born, we are told, around the year 20 or 30 of the Common Era, in Volsini, an Etruscan town north of Rome. He was of the equestrian order, which is to say, he came from a family of some standing, neither senatorial nor obscure. He appears in the historical record first as a philosopher already teaching in Rome under the reign of Nero, and it is under Nero that his troubles begin. The philosophical schools in first-century Rome were not the safe institutions of a later age. To teach philosophy in Rome, and particularly to teach Stoicism, was to risk being noticed by the emperor, and to be noticed was often to be exiled or killed. Nero regarded the Stoics with suspicion because they praised the old republic, because they praised men like Cato, who had opposed the earlier autocracy, and because Stoic teaching tended to produce senators who would not flatter him. In the year 65, when the conspiracy of Piso against Nero was uncovered, Musonius was implicated, though the historian Tacitus is careful to say that the charge against him rested only on his friendship with Rubellius Plautus, a nobleman Nero had already put to death. On the strength of this thin association, Musonius was sent to Gyaros. Gyaros. Try to picture it. It is one of the smaller Cyclades, lying north of Syros in the Aegean. Even today, in aerial photographs, it appears as a bare hump of stone rising from the sea, treeless, waterless in appearance, hostile to settlement. In the first century, it was already so notorious as a place of exile that the poet Juvenal, writing a generation later, uses the name Gyaros, the way one might use the name of a distant prison, shorthand for banishment beyond the reach of hope. The exiles sent there were expected to endure hunger, thirst, sunstroke, and above all, the psychological attrition of isolation on a barren rock at the edge of the empire. Some died, others went mad. The point of the sentence was that Rome need not stain its hands further. The island would do the work. Musonius, when he arrived, appears to have simply refused the terms of this arrangement. He walked the island. He studied its geology. He found water where the imperial administration had assumed there was none. He organized the small community of fellow exiles into something resembling a household, and he taught. We have this partly from the historian Philostratus in his Life of Apollonius of Tyana, and partly from scattered later references, so we must hold the details with some care. But the shape of it is clear enough. Musonius on Gyaros did not become a hermit. He became a teacher on the island of philosophy, and men who wished to hear him sailed out from the mainland at their own risk and sat with him among the stones. He stayed on Gyaros through the remainder of Nero's reign. When Nero fell in 68 and the civil war of the four emperors followed, Musonius was recalled. He returned to Rome. He was briefly a figure of some public honor. and it is from this later period that most of his teaching, as preserved by his student Lucius and later compilers, seems to date. But he did not remain permanently in favor. He was exiled again, this time by Vespasian, in the general expulsion of philosophers from Rome around the year 71. And though Vespasian appears to have made an exception for Musonius specifically, the shadow of banishment fell on him more than once in his life. He died sometime before the year 101. We do not know exactly when. His most famous pupil was Epictetus, who was in those years a slave in the household of Epaphroditus, one of Nero's freedmen. Epictetus attended Musonius's lectures, and through Epictetus, through the Discourses that Arrian would later record, the teaching of Musonius passes into the mainstream of what we now call Stoicism. This matters for our episode because the doctrine we are examining, the claim that exile cannot deprive us of our nature, is not merely a fine sentiment. It was tested. Musonius did not develop it in the safety of a lecture hall and then die peacefully in his bed. He developed it on the rock. He was the exile before he was the teacher of exile. Now let us return to what he did with the doctrine on Gyaros and how it functioned for him in the specific circumstance. The first thing to notice is that Musonius did not deny the physical hardship. Nowhere in the surviving fragments does he claim that thirst is not real, or that the sun on the stones does not burn, or that a man does not miss the sight of a familiar street. He accepts these things as present. What he does is refuse to grant them the meaning they are usually given. If we need nothing else than these to live rightly and according to nature, how can exile be considered an evil? The move is philosophical, not consolatory. He is not saying, "Take heart, things are not so bad." He is saying, examine the inventory of what a human life requires and examine whether the sentence handed down against you has actually removed any of it. Consider water. On Gyaros, he found the seep. Consider food. On Gyaros, he cultivated what could be cultivated, and the small community of exiles ate. Consider society. On Gyaros, he had the other exiles and the visitors who came from the mainland. Consider reason. Consider the capacity to choose one's response to what happens. Consider the capacity to speak truly, to act justly, to bear hardship without complaint. These, Musonius says, exile has not touched. There is a story preserved by Musonius in the same 9th discourse of the philosopher Diogenes of Sinope, who, when he had been driven out of his home city, is said to have gained, rather than lost, by his banishment, because it was in exile that he became a philosopher. Musonius uses this example carefully. He does not claim that exile is a good. He claims that whether exile becomes a harm or an opportunity depends entirely on the character of the man exiled, and not on the exile itself. For it is not the place, but the man's own character and reason that determines whether he lives well or ill. We may pause on this sentence. It is, in some ways, the whole of Stoic ethics compressed into a line. The place does not determine the life. The circumstance does not determine the life. What determines the life is the use we make of the reasoning faculty we carry with us everywhere. Musonius, on Gyaros, appears to have practiced what he taught in a strikingly literal way. He treated the island not as a punishment, but as a location. He treated the emperor's decree not as an injury, but as a fact, comparable to weather. He continued to do what he had done in Rome. He taught philosophy. He inquired into nature. He conversed with those around him. He did not lament. There is a fragment preserved in Stobaeus, in which Musonius is asked whether exile prevents education, and he answers that it does not, because a man in exile can still read, still think, still speak with those who visit him, still teach. He points out, dryly, that many of the philosophers Rome most admires taught in exile or in obscurity, and that the schoolroom is a convenience, not a necessity. Where a philosopher is, philosophy is. Consider what this means for the emperor's sentence. Nero had intended to remove Musonius from public life, to silence him, to erase him. What Nero found instead was that Musonius on Gyaros was still teaching, that visitors were still coming, and that the exile was, if anything, giving the man a longer reach than he had had in Rome, because now he was a philosopher who had been tested. His words carried the weight of the rock beneath his feet. There is also in the fragments a strong current of what we might call practical instruction. Musonius was, of all the Stoics whose work survives, the most concrete. He taught, for instance, that philosophers should learn a manual trade, and he suggested farming as the trade most suitable to a philosopher because it kept the body strong and the mind free. He taught that men and women alike should be educated in philosophy, a claim that was, for his time, considerably outside the mainstream. He taught that food should be simple, that clothing should be plain, that the philosopher should not distinguish himself by ostentation, but by conduct. On Gyaros, these teachings were not abstractions. Food on Gyaros was simple by necessity. Clothing on Gyaros was plain by necessity. The philosopher on Gyaros did not distinguish himself by ostentation, because there was nothing ostentatious to be had. In some sense, exile had brought Musonius's outer circumstances into alignment with his teaching. The rock enforced his own doctrine. He does not, however, boast of this. There is no fragment in which Musonius says, "Look how well I bear my exile." The tone throughout is level. He examines the question of exile as he would examine any other question, and reports what reason has found. This restraint is itself part of the teaching. The wise man does not perform his wisdom. He simply proceeds. We are told that when Musonius was eventually recalled to Rome, he did not celebrate. He returned. He resumed teaching. He did not, so far as we know, write memoirs of his suffering. He did not accuse the men who had sent him. He treated the whole episode as one might treat a long journey undertaken for other reasons, from which one has now returned. This too is instructive. The Stoic doctrine of exile is not only about how one endures banishment, it is about how one holds banishment afterward, in memory, in speech. To make one's exile the center of one's identity, to nurse the injury, to require the world to acknowledge what one has suffered, would be, in the Stoic view, to grant the exile a power over one's soul that the exile itself did not have. Musonius refuses this. Gyaros happened. Then he came back. Then he taught. The rock does not become the story. Let us now consider what the principle is actually teaching, not what it says on the surface, which we have already heard, but what its structural lesson is for a listener who is not, in fact, an exile on a Greek island. The lesson, stated plainly, is this: much of what we take to be essential to our lives is not essential, and much of what we take to be threatened when circumstances change is not in fact threatened at all. Musonius on Gyaros has, in a sense, run the experiment. He has been stripped of Rome. He has been stripped of his household, his library, his students, his familiar streets, his citizenship in the ordinary sense, his standing in the eyes of the powerful. What remains, he remains. His reason remains. His capacity to think, to speak, to teach, to act well toward those around him, all of this remains, and this, he finds, is enough. Now the temptation, when we hear this, is to receive it as a kind of consolation prize. Yes, yes, we say, if everything else were taken, at least reason would remain, at least we could still think. But Musonius is not offering a consolation prize. He is making a stronger claim. He is claiming that reason and the exercise of virtue were what we had all along, and that the other things, the household, the standing, the streets, were never the substance of the life, but only its decoration. This is a hard doctrine. It is hard because most of us have, in fact, arranged our lives around the decoration and treat the decoration as the substance. We locate ourselves in a city, in a profession, in a set of relationships, in a familiar arrangement of objects and rooms, and if any of this is threatened, we experience the threat as a threat to ourselves. Musonius says, this is a misreading of where you are. You are not in the city. You are not in the profession. You are in your own reason, and your reason is portable. Consider what this implies about fear. Most of the things we fear are the loss of the decoration. We fear losing the job, losing the house, losing the reputation, losing the familiar arrangement. The Stoic move, of which Musonius is a particularly clear exponent, is to notice that these fears, if reason is truly the substance of the life, are misplaced. They are fears for something that was never essential to begin with. This does not mean, Musonius would insist, that we should be indifferent to the decoration. The Stoics were not ascetics in that sense. They accepted that a good house is preferable to a bad one, that health is preferable to sickness, that the company of friends is preferable to loneliness. What they insisted upon was that these preferable things are not the good, and that the good, which lies in the character of the man himself, cannot be given or taken by circumstance. So the lesson has two parts. First, know what you actually possess. Second, know what can and cannot be taken. What you actually possess, in the Stoic accounting, is your reason, your capacity for judgment, your capacity to respond well to what happens. This is the substance. Everything else is on loan and may be recalled at any time and should be held accordingly. What can be taken is the rest. The house, the job, the city, the reputation, even the body, eventually, all of it. Musonius is not telling you that these things will not be taken. He is telling you that when they are taken, you will find, if you have understood correctly, that you have not been taken. You will still be there. Your reason will still be there. The exile will not have reached you. There is, in this teaching, a curious kind of freedom. Not the freedom to do whatever one wishes, which the Stoics regarded as a childish notion, but the freedom of not being at the mercy of what one cannot control. If Nero can send you to Gyaros, and Gyaros cannot deprive you of what matters, then Nero, for all his power, has less power over you than he thinks. And this is a discovery that can be made without waiting for Nero to send you anywhere. One must consider, and this is where the lesson turns inward, that most of us are governed by threats that have not yet materialized. We are governed by the fear of what might be taken. Musonius, having actually had things taken, reports back from the far side of the loss and says, "It was not as it seemed. What I thought was my life turned out to be my surroundings. My life came with me. This is not a claim one can make from the armchair. It is a claim one earns by having been to the rock. Musonius earned it. And through the fragments, through Epictetus, through the long line of Stoic teaching that follows, he offers the finding to us, who may not have been to Gyaros, but who will, in one form or another, encounter our own version of it. The version we encounter may not be an island. It may be an illness. It may be a loss. It may be the slow revision of what we thought our life would be. It may be exile from a version of ourselves we can no longer inhabit. The forms are many. The structure is the same. Something we took to be essential is taken, and we find, if we have prepared, that we remain. Musonius would say, prepare, not by rehearsing catastrophe, but by attending now, while things are quiet, to what your life actually consists of. Notice what you have located outside yourself and what you have located within. Notice which of these you would carry to Gyaros and which of these Gyaros would strip from you. And notice above all, whether the things Gyaros could not touch are the things you have been living for, or whether you have been living for the decoration all along. We come now to the close. The philosopher on the island did not, so far as we know, write for us. He wrote, if he wrote at all, for the men beside him on the rock, and for the visitors who came out from the mainland, and for the students who, later, in Rome, would sit with him and try to understand what he had learned there. What has reached us is fragmentary. A few discourses preserved by Lucius, scattered sayings in Stobaeus, references in Tacitus, in Philostratus, in Aulus Gellius. From this fragmentary record, we assemble the figure of a man who was sent to a rock in order to die, and who lived and taught and returned and taught again, and treated the whole matter as a lesson in the difference between what belongs to us and what does not. The question he leaves with us is not whether we could endure Gyaros. Most of us will never be tested in that particular way. The question is quieter than that, and closer. If you were to take an inventory now, this evening, of what you consider essential to your life, and if you were to sort the items into what could be carried with you anywhere and what could not, which list would be longer? And of the things on the second list, the ones that would not travel, how many of them have you allowed yourself to believe are the substance of who you are? Musonius would not press you for an answer. He would let the question sit. He would perhaps remark that the answer will change over time as one attends to it, and that the exercise is not to reach a conclusion, but to keep taking the inventory, patiently, without alarm, until one has learned to recognize the shape of what is one's own. The rock is still there, in the Aegean, waterless in appearance, hostile to settlement. The philosopher who was sent to it has been dead for 19 centuries, and yet the finding he brought back, that exile cannot deprive us of our nature, remains available to anyone who is willing to sit with it long enough to see whether it is true. We are told he did not complain. We are told he did not perform his wisdom. We are told he simply proceeded. Let us reflect on that, and let it be enough for tonight.